Lesson 2 in Chapter 5 is all about the history of the region in this western portion of the United States, west of the Mississippi. We're going to look through 3 different sections. First is the early settlements on how people moved and expanded this region, and they ran into the natives that already lived there. We're going to then study the westward expansion, what drove and created what is now the country that we live in today, by the accumulation of all this different land and property, the couple different ways in which that was taken care of. And then lastly, we're going to take a look at how agriculture and industry really drove the kind of development of this portion of our country forward. We begin by making sure that we have our textbook set and ready. You can see your online textbook here. You could use the option to listen to this text or follow along in our video. And then you have your note page open, ready to go, in which it has all 3 of those sections. In the very first section, it talks about the early settlements, in which we'll answer these 5 questions that go along with our reading. In the second section, you will highlight the timeline or fill in the information from each of the years, the significant events that occurred during the westward expansion of the United States. And then lastly, you're going to fill in this graphic organizer of the different types of agriculture and industry in terms of primary economic activities and secondary economic activities. We'll break down what those items are in our reading. Let's jump into it. Western half of the United States, the history of this region. Our thought question, our essential question is, why do people live where they live? How has this historical development of this part of the world influenced how people have settled in a region and then now developed that region to where it is today? Question for you. Would you rather live in California or in Texas? Where would you rather live? I'm going to quick show you a video that kind of introduces this idea of what's changing in the political landscape and in the overall economic landscape of both of these countries. California is very well known for being the place of kind of fame and enterprise and technology development, but if you would believe it, in today's climate, the way in which real estate costs and the cost of living is in California, it's exceedingly expensive. So more people are actually leaving California and moving to Texas than you might think. And here's an example of why that might be happening.
As a freelance photographer, Dwayne Conder knows his way around a camera. That's come in handy now that he's selling a lot of what he owns on eBay. He's getting ready to move.
What's it going to be like to leave your neighborhood?
It'll be rather traumatic.
Dwayne and his family have lived in this home near San Diego for 11 years.
It was like somebody turned off the spigot. Where did the work go? Literally, it's like you woke up one day, there's no work.
The dot-com boom drew them from Texas to California, and now the prolonged job bust is forcing them out. California's unemployment rate is 11.7%. Dwayne cannot find work, and last week the bank foreclosed on his family's home.
You viewed California as the land of opportunity. How do you view it now?
Personally, I feel like it's the land that we need to get out of very fast.
The Condors are moving back to Texas, where unemployment is lower, 8.4%. In 2010, Texas gained nearly 75,000 new residents, while California lost nearly 130,000. The biggest state-to-state shift in the country was people leaving the Golden State and heading to the Lone Star State.
And jobs are just one reason. Housing is another. This 3-bedroom home in Los Angeles recently sold for more than $1 million. Yet, here in a suburb of Austin, Texas, this 4-bedroom home sold for $380,000. The people who bought it moved from California.
We'll stay here in Texas, and we visit California quite a bit.
Bill Gagne moved his family and his computer consulting business from California to Austin. They traded in a 1-bedroom apartment for this 4-bedroom home.
If we would have stayed in California, in order for us to make it in an area where we would want to live, we would need to be a 2-income family.
But with the lower cost of living and no personal income tax in Texas, Bill's wife Jessica now stays home with their daughter Gwen.
We go to gym, we go to swimming lessons, we do it all. And if we lived in California, I couldn't do that.
Yet they do miss that California weather and the ocean.
My very first surfboard, I can't get rid of it.
But for now, they'll trade blue waters for greener pastures.
Now, the reason why I wanted you to think of this is because the western part of the United States is so massive. There are so many different takes on the different places you can live, the physical geography that we learned about in Lesson 1. Now as we learn about the history, you're also going to find these major differences in how these places came to be settled and came to be developed. And there's still changes that are happening today, as you just saw, based on the influx or the on people coming in and going out based on the different factors that are in these places. But how do we get to where we are today? Let's take a look back at the history of this portion. Our objectives for today's lesson is to identify major cities and rural areas, analyze the challenges facing the region, and describe the economy of the region as it develops throughout this history. The Native Americans' way of life can be found on page 156. First people to live in the western United States of what is now the United States were Native Americans. Native Americans belonged to dozens of different groups. Each group had its own language and culture and followed a lifestyle well suited to the area where they lived. Native Americans' way of life. The tribes of the Great Plains adopted different ways to live on these grasslands. Some farmed and hunted. They settled along rivers where they tended fields and grew corn, squash, and other foods. Other Native Americans on the plains hunted the herds of bison, along with obtaining meat, the people of other parts of the animals for clothing and homes. These people were nomadic. They were always on the move. Few trees grew there, so the nomadic peoples of the plains built homes called teepees, using animal hides stretched over long poles. Teepees could be folded up and moved fairly easily, allowing plains people to take their homes with them as they traveled. Their nomadic means they had to move from place to place, and if they were following the bison or the buffalo, they would just simply go wherever that herd was going based on the season, because the buffalo are going to move wherever the food is that is available for them. The Pueblo people of the Southwest, so farther to the south, lived in villages that the Spanish called pueblos, or towns in Spanish. These villages' multi-storied homes were made of dried mud. The Pueblo practiced by farming, conserving scarce water to grow corn, beans, and squash. You can see one of those pueblos on the picture here was built out of that natural material that is in this landscape. In the Northwest, Native Americans fished for salmon and hunted sea mammals. On land, they hunted small game, taking advantage of the thick forests that grew in the region's climate. They built large homes out of wood. You go up into the Northwest, you have that climate that's coming in from the Pacific Ocean, so you have a lot of precipitation and rain. Therefore, you have a lot of plentiful growth in this region. You can use the resources that are there to build your home. So regardless of where these people lived, their home or their way of life was always based on how the land was shaped and how the resources kind of dictated to them how they would go about surviving. When Europeans came to North America, the lives of Native Americans changed dramatically. For example, Europeans introduced new animals such as horses and sheep. Horses made hunting bison easier for the plains people. The Navajo of the Southwest began herding sheep, but Europeans also brought diseases that killed large numbers of Native Americans. Colonial times. The Spanish were the first Europeans to come to the region. In 1598, they established the first European settlement in the region near what is now El Paso, Texas. By the early 1600s, they found Santa Fe, New Mexico. Soon they spread out all over the upper reaches of the Rio Grande. In the 1700s, the Spanish settled parts of California and Texas. Central to those settlements were missions. These church-based communities, led by Catholic priests, were meant to house native peoples. The priests hoped the Native Americans would adopt the Christianity and Spanish way of life. They relied on the work of the native peoples to grow food. The land and the climate across much of the region were similar to what they had left from Spain. The Spanish settlers introduced numerous types of crops that grew in Spain but not exist in the Western Hemisphere. These included oranges, grapes, apples, peaches, pears, and olives. The Spanish also adopted crops that grew in the Western Hemisphere but not in Spain. These crops included corn, tomatoes, and avocados. So because they have a similar climate, you could actually grow things that were native to their own country back in Europe and Spain in this same climate here in what is the southwestern portion of this western United States. So because those climates are the same, you can actually have a lot more of these different types of fruits and foods that are growing that would help them continue to survive. Because people are only going to survive where they have those basic needs of food, shelter, and water being met, and that natural safety. So once they've got these places established, they're producing the amount of food to support the populations that are growing in these colonies. In the 1680s, France claimed the land drained by the Mississippi River, which included much of the land east of the Rocky Mountains. It is called the vast area or the Louisiana Territory. Over the years, the French placed a few settlements along the Mississippi. The most important was in New Orleans. It was founded in the early 1700s as a port for the shipping goods from the river's valley. Now, as we move from this portion, you're going to see that now there's a change happening in what is westward expansion. As we studied the East Coast, people got to the Appalachian Mountains, and then they eventually moved past those Appalachian Mountains all the way to the Mississippi. Well, that didn't stop there. That westward expansion, after people settle along the Mississippi, is going to continue to move into this westward area. When the American Revolution ended in 1783, the territory of the United States was entirely east of the Mississippi River. Much of this land was still unsettled by white Americans. But after the Revolution, they quickly began moving to the frontier in large numbers. frontier is a region just beyond the edge of a settled area. So they're going to this unknown, unsettled area, besides obviously the natives that already have occupied this area. Soon Americans turned their eyes west of the river, eager for more land. Exploring the West. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased the vast Louisiana Territory from France. The Louisiana Purchase, that's this entire brown region from Louisiana all the way through kind of this upper western portion. You've got Nebraska, the Dakotas, Montana, all the way through this entire region, Colorado, Wyoming, parts of that are included in the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase gave the United States most of the land between the Mississippi and the Rocky Mountains. Soon after, Meriwether Lewis and William and Clark, maybe you've heard Lewis and Clark, led nearly 50 men to explore parts of the area. The Lewis and Clark expedition lasted more than 2 years as they traveled from St. Louis to what is now the coast of Oregon and back. They traveled along the Missouri River as far as they could, and then they proceeded overland by horseback. They mapped the land and rivers they saw. They recorded data about the plants and animals living there. They also made peaceful contact with Native American peoples. By reaching the Pacific Ocean, they helped set an American claim to Oregon and Washington. So through this travel, what's called the Oregon Trail, all the way out to Oregon and Washington, they're able to actually to reach the Pacific Ocean and then claim this overall territory for the rest of the United States. Over the next decades, other explorers helped open new areas. Meanwhile, hardy adventurers called mountain men began to trap beavers in the Rocky Mountains. Their travels added more knowledge to the geography of the American West. They also discovered ways through the mountains that the settlers would use later. So these different now travel means are being set up and established that are getting more and more people from this eastern and central portion of the United States to this western frontier. How does it become settled, though? By the 1830s, some Americans had come to believe the idea of manifest destiny. According to this concept, the United States had the right to extend its boundaries to the Pacific Ocean. This belief helped promote the nation's westward movement. Basically, there's this idea that America is growing and America is the rightful owner of this land that is in this region, even if the native peoples live there. So manifest destiny is the idea that the American government can take these lands from these native peoples. Obviously, looking at it in hindsight, you'd say that, well, that's not the right thing to do, but this was what was carried out at this time because that land has an increased value, probably even more valuable than what these people that lived there was actually attributed to. So the westward expansion continues to happen through this ideal, this kind of notion of thinking that we can claim all of this for ourselves in kind of a greed or a money grab type of activity. Settlers began moving to the rich farmlands in what is now Oregon. Traveling in wagons, they took a long route called the Oregon Trail. It carried them across the Great Plains and through the passes into the Rocky Mountains. Over the years, thousands of people moved to Oregon. What is now Oregon and Washington, however, were claimed by both the United States and Great Britain. In 1846, two countries reached an agreement. Under the deal, the United States gained control of those two future states. Britain kept control of the lands to the north, which became part of Canada. Meanwhile, some American settlers had moved to what is now Texas, which belonged to Mexico at that time. In the next decade, they declared independence. They set up an independent country, though many Texans wanted to join the United States. In 1845, the United States annexed or took control of Texas. So Texas was originally set up as its own country by the people that lived there. There was the United States, there was Texas, and then there was the Spanish settlements in Mexico. Texas wanted to be its own country. The United States, again, with Manifest Destiny, said, Texas, you're not going to be on your own. You're going to join us because we're stronger together in that way. Some Americans hoped to gain California and other lands that were part of Mexico. This desire led to a war with Mexico, which the United States won. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, it's the same year that Wisconsin became a state, Mexico gave the United States a vast area that later formed all of California, Utah, Nevada, and parts of Colorado, Arizona, Wyoming, and New Mexico. This territory added a sizable Spanish-speaking population to the United States. So that's the Mexican secession here. All of this region was given to us through that treaty after the Mexican-American War. When gold was discovered in California, thousands of people streamed there in hopes of making their fortunes. This mass migration is called the California Gold Rush. San Francisco and other cities grew rapidly as a result. Hence why we have the San Francisco 49ers, because this was in 1849 that this massive gold rush was taking place, and more of this movement was happening to California. Western lands in the 1800s. Later in the 1800s came more discoveries of mineral wealth in other areas in the region. Each new discovery brought more people to the region in hopes of becoming wealthy. A huge reserve of silver lured them to Nevada in the 1870s. Also, during the decade, gold attracted people to South Dakota's Black Hills and to Colorado. At the same time, the nation was building railroads to join the eastern and western areas. The first line from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean was completed in 1869. Others followed. Trains carried settlers to the western states, and some started farms or ranches. Others settled in towns that sprang up along the rail lines or near mines. So the first settlement of the major cities in this area are going to be right along these different railroads. You can kind of see from the Mississippi River here what would have been connected to Chicago. You go through what is the northern portion of Colorado. Then as you're going through these mountains, you've got to make a way through those mountains to get to Utah, Salt Lake City, Sacramento, and San Francisco, but all connected by a railroad that offered the best way for transportation to happen at this time period. As a result of these changes, the population of the West grew rapidly in 1900. More than twice as many people lived in the West as in 1880. So 20 years later, the population just blew up and doubled in that short amount of time. The Great Plains changed dramatically as this population increases. The vast grasslands were turned into farms and ranches. Settlers hunted the huge herds of bison and other animals. Some of the animals became extinct or disappeared from Earth. There were huge changes to the biosphere of the plains. Because there's such an influx of people use the land that's there, and there wasn't this idea of conservation or saving things for future generations, so they just use it up as rapidly and as fast as possible to where they're almost depleting many of these resources faster than these resources are able to regenerate. The spread of the white settlements came at the expense of Native Americans at this time. Native Americans suffered from the changes to the environment and the growth of the population. Farms, ranches, and railroads and mines took away the Native American lands, and these are the places that the Native Americans had hunted and farmed for many, many years. Some Native American groups resisted the changes, but they were outnumbered. Finally, Native Americans were forced to live on reservations. These are lands that are set aside for them. Reservations were often located in areas with poor soil and had farming difficulty. So Manifest Destiny says the American people are going to move themselves west. If they wanted to take over land, the Native peoples that lived there were moved to a specific area on a reservation. There's actually evidence of this here in Wisconsin because there are Native American reservations here in our own state, and there are other places throughout the entire West that this same type of practice was taken, which that land was claimed, and then these people had to be moved off of it. It's not necessarily right, but it was what was done during this time in history. Gaining new lands. During the late 1800s, the United States made its last land acquisitions. The first new territory gained was Alaska in 1867. The United States purchased Alaska from Russia for just over $7 million. The future state was so large that the cost was only about 2 cents per acre. The purchase of Alaska was not entirely popular. Some newspaper editors criticized the Secretary of State, William Seward, for agreeing for the sale. They called the area Seward's Icebox or Seward's Folly because they thought it didn't have any value. In 1898, however, gold and copper were found in Alaska. These discoveries awakened a new interest in the land, and now there's this, again, gold rush into this last frontier, which is called Alaska. Americans also took an interest in Hawaii. In the late 1800s, business people began to grow sugar there. In the late 1880s, American sugar planters feared Hawaii's royal family would take away the power and land they acquired. Instead, they seized the government and requested the United States annex Hawaii. Again, that means take control of it. The United States is claiming Hawaii. In 1900, the government agreed to do so. The agriculture and industry in this region. Checking on your notes, you should have answered these 5 questions in the early settlements and then filled in the specific dates for those. Sorry, that was my dog. For those ideas. We'll go through and make sure that we have these incorrectly. In 1803, President Jefferson buys the Louisiana Territory. In 1845, the U.S. annexes Texas. That means they take control of it. In 1846, U.S. gains control of Oregon and Washington from Great Britain. In 1848, U.S. gets California, Utah, Nevada, parts of Colorado, Arizona, Wyoming from Mexico. In 1867, the U.S. buys Alaska from Russia. In 1900, the U.S. annexes Hawaii. In our last section today, we're going to look at the primary economic activities and secondary economic activities that are going on from the agriculture and industry growth in this region throughout its history. As people moved into the states west of the Mississippi, they developed various ways of earning a living. For many decades, their choices depended on the resources of the area where they settled. Most made their living in primary economic activities that extracted resources directly from the earth. These included farming, ranching, mining, lumbering, and fishing. So primary economic activities take resources directly from earth, the natural resources. If you didn't catch that, here are the blanks that you should be filling in. Farming, ranching, mining, lumbering, fishing. Now that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's one more that we're going to read about. In the 1800s, many Americans were farmers. Many dreamed of starting farms in the West. In 1862, Congress made it easier by passing the Homestead Act. This law made public land in the western United States free to anyone who claimed the land, built a farm, and stayed on it for at least 5 years. Hundreds of thousands of people settled on the Great Plains to start a farm. Now that seems like one of the greatest ways in our history that somebody could acquire some piece of land for simply their efforts, and a way in which they could kind of change generational wealth. If you have land, that land has value. The reason why they would give it to them after 5 years is because they wanted to see if these people could actually survive out there for 5 years, which would make it really difficult to live on this without any other types of development that are already there. Life on these farms was not easy. The lack of trees made it difficult to find wood to build homes. People covered homes with sod chunks of soil held together by roots of grasses. So they had to live off the land, kind of like the natives were successfully doing many years before. Another important activity in the western states was raising cattle. Cowboys in places such as Texas herded the cattle and drove them north to towns in Colorado and Kansas that had railroad stations. There, the animals were shipped east to the cities like Chicago. Meatpacking companies butchered their animals into meat that could be sold into growing eastern cities. Cities like Denver, Kansas, Missouri, Omaha, Nebraska became major centers for processing crops and meat. Industry. The first industries in the West were also primary economic activities. The industries concentrated on using the resources of the region. Companies set up silver and copper mines. So we said that mining was one of them. The specific mines were silver and copper mines in this region before the actual gold rushes that were going to happen as well. Other cut trees in the Northwest to provide lumber for building homes and ship, and then fish canneries were important along the Pacific coast and Gulf Coast. So fish canneries, or the fishing industry, was a way in which you could provide a way in which to feed tons and tons of people through that natural resource as well. In the 1900s, new primary industries developed. The growing popularity of cars created rising demand for oil. So the last one that we don't have filled in is actually the oil industry. The oil industry boomed in Texas, Oklahoma, and California. Oil in northern Alaska became usable in the 1970s with the completion of the major construction project, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, or TAPS. The project built a pipeline from the northern oil fields to the port of Valdez in the south so that the oil could be shipped to continental states. Although primary economic activities remained dominant as the region developed, more secondary economic activities began to emerge. So here's where you would look to fill in the second set of graphic organizers. These secondary economic activities are turning raw materials into manufactured goods. So you take the primary activity of the material that you're harvesting that are natural resources and turning those into something. Because those areas have these, this is where a lot of manufacturing is going to be prevalent. These are the industries that turned raw materials into manufactured goods. Many cities across the region became major manufacturing centers. Los Angeles specialized in machine tools and automobiles. San Francisco became a major shipbuilding center. So machine tool manufacturing, automobiles, and shipbuilding. Other new industries focus on recreation and entertainment. Southern California became the home to the movie industry, so I would write that down, movie industry or entertainment. Las Vegas turned into a major resort city for its casinos, hotels, shops, and restaurants. Areas in the Rockies with great natural beauty also became places for skiing and their favorite vacation spots. So you can have listed in that section, that entire portion, for resorts, recreation, and the movie industry for all of those. So shipbuilding, automobiles, machine tool making, the movie industry. The last one was the resort or recreation to be filled in and completed. That summarizes our study of the western half of the United States. Hopefully you have each and every part of your homework done. Again, in the first section, you're answering these 5 questions on the lines provided. In the second section, Mr. Shane went through this together with you on those different dates and timelines of the major events. And lastly, we took care of adding in the primary and secondary economic activities. God's blessings.